And we are moving into our first conversation for this morning. As we noted, there is a UN 75 dialogue that is coming up, and we have with us the coordinator. She is going to be talking about how the wider public can get engaged in this conversation and share their thoughts and feedback. So we have Carolyn Sandiford with us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Marlene, and I understand you're riding solo. Is that the terminology we use?
That's right. They ditch me.
Yes, I know. I'm going to have a conversation with Gavin and what's the John? It's John. Yes. I'm going to have a conversation with them. They're not allowed to do these things to you.
I know. Let me not give them too much of a hard time. John's under the weather this morning.
Oh my. So it's good to be here, Marlene. As usual, it's always a pleasure to be and open your eyes in the morning and to participate in the great conversations, of which UN 75 dialogue is one of them.
Yeah. And, I appreciate the opportunity that we have to talk with you and the work that you're doing, because very often we talk about a lot of the local issues that we face. And of course, those are what are most pertinent to us. But everything fits into the global picture as well. And sometimes we kind of have to zoom out and understand it in context as well. Let's start off by talking about the UN 75 dialogue and what the objectives are here.
Absolutely. First of all, I'm the UN 75 facilitator for the UN 75 dialogues. Mm-hmm. And what is happening right now is that UN is celebrating 75 years.
Yes.
And as it is also a visionary institution in that it deals with immediate issues, but it is also visionary in that it looks at the long term as well. So the whole concept of UN 75 is that we are here 75 years. What are the immediate issues? What are the immediate priorities that we must deal with, considering that the world, to some extent, Marlene, has been reconfigured, if we can put it that way, with COVID-19 and so many other issues that are confronting us today, but also looking at the world that we want to build, the world that we want to shape. Many of us, depending on what age you are, and I'll try to keep away from my age at this point in time, but many of us we have generations. They talk about the varying generations. There's the millennials, there's X, there's Y. There were the baby boomers and so on and so forth. So different generations at different time have different aspirations, different ideals. But whatever we do and however we think, whatever we do today is shaping that future that we want to see. And so the conversation that UN 75 is all about is really starting to talk about what are immediate priorities, considering that the world, as I have said, has to some extent been reconfigured because of COVID-19, but also what is it that the world that we want to see the next 15, the next 20 years, what's going to happen. In 2045, for example, UN will be celebrating 100 years. What is the world that we want to see? And I think that is where the conversation is. That's what the conversation is about.
Now, this idea of getting a global dialogue started is really interesting, because when you think of what people like to call the top-down approach, this is more getting the grassroots, the everyday person perspective to kind of feed into a bigger picture. How much does this fit within how global goals and agendas are normally created?
Absolutely. I think what it does do is, to some extent, build on the conversation that led to the Sustainable Development Goals. If you may recall, prior to the Sustainable Development Goals, there was the Millennium Development Goals, which were set up to 2015. And then we had the Post-Millennium Development Goals, which moves from 2015, of course, to 2030. And so when the MDGs were being designed, At that point in time, while it had the conversation at the what we call, you refer, the grassroots level, the bottom level, there was a lot of decision making taking place at the top level.
Yeah.
When it came to the SDGs, that changed significantly, and one of the great achievements of the SDGs, and one of the great characteristics in shaping the SDGs, was actually the wide and diverse contribution that was made, particularly, Marlene, when it comes to the role of civil society. Civil society became much more involved and engaged. The grassroots conversation was much more involved and engaged, leading into the SDGs. So I think what is happening now is that you're now building on that platform. Mm-hmm. But I think more as important is that to understand that when the SDGs came about, that was, as I said, mentioned 2015 to lead to 2030. But what has happened, as we have seen, is that a lot of the development gains that have been made and yet to be determined, so I could say may have been made during this period up to 2020, a lot has been wiped away. And for many reasons, we are seeing major challenges and major risks taking place in the world today. And I think more than ever, COVID-19, and if you recall in our political conversation, we used to use this word unprecedented.
Yes.
Yes. But what we've seen is an unprecedented reconfiguration in the way we do things. And so what's going to happen next? But as important, there are also other mega issues that are taking place. Climate change. Mm-hmm. We have seen how the changing climate has been changing our weather. And Belize just recently have gone through a major flooding incident. The records are showing that millions of dollars have been lost due to weather-induced incidents. And so when you're dealing with developmental issues and there's the investment side of things, one have to also be looking at what are the risks that we're going to take, but as important, what are the opportunities that are going to be there? Yeah. And now 2020, the issue then becomes, yes, we have set in place, and Belize has signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals to look at issues of poverty, education, gender equality, climate action, partnerships, and so on and so forth. So now, as you mentioned previously, it's like building on that, but understanding that there has been significant events that have changed the environment and the landscape in which we live.
Yeah, I think that's such a critical point, because as we look at what's happening around us in this global pandemic, one thing we know for certain, whatever efforts were made, we're about, 1/3 way through in the work for the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, all
Absolutely.
These very critical markers that we're trying to achieve by 2030, and I mean we across the world. But
Absolutely.
1/3 of the way in, there is guaranteed to be major setback in a lot of these milestones. I mean, when you talk about how the pandemic will completely change the situation of poverty, not just in Belize, but around the world,
globally,
or
right,
in education access, in the sustainability of communities. Is this also a moment where perhaps it's an assessment of what has been undone and what new work has to be done?
Absolutely. And I think that becomes one of the key features of the dialogue. And you spoke about the grassroots and the bottom-up approach. What the UN 75 is looking at is we are also at a milestone in our institutional history at 75 years. And they've done such great work throughout globally. And in Belize, UN has been doing a tremendous amount of work in Belize. So the issue then becomes what becomes our immediate priorities based on all that is happening, but as well, what are going to be the priorities of the future? Because there are a lot of risks, as we have seen, as we have looked at issues, for example, we spoke about climate change, we spoke about, there's also the issue of technology. We have seen how perhaps COVID-19 has accelerated the use of technology and innovation. But there are also issues that come along with that, because while we can look at technology as something that can, as we have seen, created greater opportunities for say entrepreneurs, for education, for healthcare, and so on and so forth. There are also risks that comes with technology. You're looking at privacy issues, security issues, digital literacy, the digital divide. So there are things that come along with their risk, but there are also opportunities that are there. And I think the whole concept of the dialogue is to start looking at what is it primarily that we need to do now, because we can think long term, Marlene, but the reality people are experiencing and confronting with many challenges as we speak. Yesterday, for example, I was hearing a conversation of a young woman who single parent lives with the mother. The mother is the support system in terms of taking care of the child, because her job does not give her the salary that she earns is not that much to afford a babysitter. So you rely on these support systems, but then your support systems are also vulnerable, because the mother is at an age where puts her at a higher risk. And yet this is an individual who has to go to work and work in a scenario that is vulnerable, in that she has to relate to many people during the day. And so we're looking at things, yes, globally, but also at that individual level. And so it's how is it that as a society, we start looking at what is it that we need to do now? And then we then also have to look at it, what it is that we need to do to shape the world, say by 2045. Yeah. And that in itself starts to bring, as you mentioned a little earlier, the global issues, because climate change is a global issue, COVID-19 is a global issue. How is it that we find ways in which to address these immediate priorities, but at the same time see opportunities that may be there for us to ensure that the gains that we have made over time are not so eroded, and that we find a way to deliver on those sustainable development goals, but also on the future that people want to see.
Yeah. A huge part of getting everyone to join into the conversation is also kind of demystifying how the UN plays a role within our local context. Because very often I have heard people speak of it as a foreign agenda, but not, and I think that, you know, because it's based in other places and just the setup of the international organization, it's natural for people to understand that. But we play a role. We are a part of the United Nations.
Absolutely.
So can you put that into context for us as to how they work and how we benefit?
Absolutely. I want to, prior to responding, say that I am not an employee of the UN. Yeah. I am the UN 75 facilitator for the dialogue. However, what I would say is that UN is a global institution, but the global institution is made up of member countries. Mm-hmm. And more, we are seeing the need for issues of cooperation across sectors and borders. And so they play a vital role in that sort of cooperation, but also in terms of addressing issues that are issues or challenges that are raging within the world. From issues of violence and peace and conflict, we've always seen the logo, for example, in these war-torn areas, in humanitarian crisis. The UN has always been one of the first institution with people on the ground. But locally, the UN has also played a great role in terms of supporting and funding programs and projects, whether it's supporting the government directly through policy initiatives, and so on and so forth, as well as supporting civil society. I can say, putting on my Belize Association of Planners hat, that we have had tremendous support from the UN UNDP, particularly the GEF Fund, to look at pioneering urban resilience. They've also done a lot of work in conservation and environment, in democracy, and so on and so forth. But what I will say, though, I think the issue of being a foreign entity, I think perhaps because they don't tout their own horns too much, but I think also because the communication and their role in development maybe has not necessarily been highlighted or elevated as much in the discourse, and the partnerships that they have with the government, because one must always understand that the Belize is a signatory or a member of the UN. Oftentimes, Marlene, you would see or hear that the foreign minister is speaking at the UN or the prime minister is speaking at the UN because we are a member of the UN. But perhaps I think the government has not done sufficient to share with the Belizean public as to what that role, what it is to be a member of the UN. You may hear from time to time that they've signed conventions. So you hear about conventions of the rights of persons with diverse ability, or you hear about convention for human rights. You're going to hear all these things, but it doesn't trickle down to the Belizean people to that extent as to why the government signed and what is the role of the government in partnering with the UN to do these things. So UNS is a global institution, but it is also an institution that is fueled and shaped by what takes place within countries. And I think this is what the UN 75 dialogue is all about. There are over 142 countries that are experiencing many challenges today. Belize is only one of such countries, but our voice must also be heard and our voice must also be counted. And so at this point, you mentioned earlier, yes, an assessment, because things are changing and life is dynamic, it's not static. And it's how is it that as Belizeans, we can contribute to that conversation. And so the UN dialogue is about getting the views of diverse and perspectives of diverse people, diverse groupings, so that we can start talking about what are our immediate priorities. These are then translated into the programs and projects of the UN, which is then executed locally in Belize as well as globally, meaning that it is executed in other countries as well. So this conversation is very important. And the projects and the work, the programs that the UN engage in are also partnered with that of the government, because we must always appreciate that the UN doesn't act on its own. It acts in partnership with the governments of the world.
Yeah. Now, there'll be people watching who are assuming here that, okay, this is a NGO type of activity or a government department's activity, perhaps even people from the business sector. But what the aim is, based on what you've explained, is that any single person in this country, even young people, can get engaged in this dialogue.
Absolutely. And the dialogue is about acquiring, reaching out, getting the perspectives of a diverse set of people. You want to hear the perspective of the young people. You want to hear the perspective of women. You want to hear this perspective of men. You want to hear the perspective of the elderly, of persons with diverse ability, of indigenous groups, of academia, of civil society, of the government, of religious institutions, of the LGBTQ community. Everybody is linked to the country and has a role to shape the future of this country. One of the guiding principles of the UN, Marlene, is to leave no one behind. Mm-hmm. So you cannot talk about moving forward if you do not include the voice or the issue or the concern of every single person. And so the way the dialogues are set up is that we agreed on having what we call open dialogues. We've already had one. We had one last Wednesday, and we're having one today at 12 noon. So this one is like a lunch bag. Okay. So when you take your lunch break, you bring your lunch bag, put your lunch bag on the table and link on to the conversation. So we're having one today at 12. And then we're having two more open dialogues, which are going to be held next week, Tuesday, at 10 and next week Thursday at 10. We are also doing what we call this specific interest dialogue, as we mentioned, leave no one behind. So the open dialogues are open to everybody and anybody. And I have shared my email address and I've shared my number. And I have on my Facebook post, and we've been emailing as much people as we can and encouraging them to join the dialogue. So we've had one already.
How'd it
and
go?
We have, it went wonderful. The conversation was rich, was spirited. And to use the word that you said earlier, we talked of earlier, diverse. Yeah. Because we had Belizeans, and we also had some Belizeans in the diaspora who participated as well. We had young people, we had persons from civil society, we had representation from academia, we had representation from women's group. So it was really diverse. We even had representation from some very young people who participated, women, men, and each coming from a different perspective, talking about governance issues, education, healthcare. And what we try to do out of these dialogues is to pull out what is the priority of that based on what people are saying. And the dialogues also, we do some polling within the dialogues, Marlene. So what becomes fascinating is when you're doing the dialogue, that people are responding to the polls and you're seeing the word that is been written the most, jumping out of you, getting larger and larger and larger. And that tells you how people are thinking and what are some of the key issues. So that first one went very well. We're excited about it.
You're not going to give us some insight into what that that word was coming out of that
I don't want to do that because what it made, I don't want it to influence what may happen next. Yeah. But what I can say is that there's clearly some key issues and threads were coming out. Yeah. And we need to wait until the others to kind of start pulling it together, because the whole idea is not to in any way say this one is more important than that one, but rather at the end of the day to capture what are the immediate priorities of the Belizean people in terms of what those immediate priorities that they would want to see the UN tackle globally as well as in Belize, and then what are those future priorities. And as important, how we can collaborate. Because Marlene, at the end of the day, we cannot do this on our own. There is no way, individually, we can't do things on our own. As a country, we can't do things on our own. And so the collaboration between us and other countries, facilitated through the UN, is vital to us addressing many of the challenges that we face. So we have those open dialogues, and then we also have what we call the specific interest dialogue. So that means we are currently organizing dialogues around students and academia, around young people, around indigenous people, around the LGBTQ community, around women. We're looking at artists, the creative artists, what are their perspective. And so all of these religious people, the spirit and spiritual, the business community, as you mentioned a little earlier, every single person and grouping is important. And so we are organizing what we call the specific dialogues, which are around specific issues. And we are at this point reaching out and having these discussions with specific interest groups to hold these dialogues.
Now, how do you manage the conversation? How does it actually work? Because and taking into consideration that you want voices from many different backgrounds, and not everyone knows all the SDGs or what SDGs are, but they want an opportunity to have their voice be heard on what's happening in the country or what's happening in their communities.
Absolutely. One of the things we do with the dialogues, or one of the methodology we use, is not necessarily to focus on the SDGs per se, but to look more on the issue and then link that issue to the SDG. Yeah. So, for example, one of the key components of hosting the dialogue, we would start with the conversation as what if. So if I ask you and I say, come up with a what if this was in place, this would be the scenario. My what if, whenever I'll use that to say, one of my what if has been, what if there was no corruption in Belize? What would Belize be like? You know? And so different groupings come up with different what ifs. And so that if there was no corruption in Belize, what would Belize be like? It then starts to direct you towards the Belize you would want to see. In the event that this was not happen, then it then feeds the conversation, what has to happen to then let you reach that point. And then you start talking then of those very issues that we spoke about, issues of poverty, issues of gender inequality, bridging the divide, looking at things like demographics. Marlene, many times I have been on this station with another cap, and we have spoke about the shifting demographics in Belize. Right. How it's changing, and we are not really responding to it. And of course, there's always the climate crisis, and then we have these issues of conflict and violence and so on and so forth. So you would have in different parts of the world, like for example, if you scan the news right now, you will see in places like Ethiopia, where there's a lot of internal violence and conflict. But that is happening in Belize also. The issue of violence in the murder and mayhem, domestic violence. In fact, I think right now we are celebrating, well, I won't say so, but looking at 16 days of recognizing 16 days of activism to address the issues of gender-based violence. So these are all issues that people speak about when they're in the conversation. Things like education, access to healthcare. Okay. COVID-19 brought up elevated the issue of healthcare, because that is where we are now. So it's how we pull all this information together, and through the polling that we have employed, we then say, what would be your immediate priority? What are the future priorities? What are some of the obstacles that we have and barriers that we have to take down in order to create the Belize that we want to see and the global world that we want to see?
So is there anonymity? Do you have to give information? What's the standard there?
Absolutely. Now, what we do, there is a registration process that people would register to participate in the dialogue. It's a registration process, of course, that you put in your name and information about yourself, email address, and so on, so that we can communicate to you the dates of the dialogue. People will select which dialogue they wish to attend. And also it provides us with information that we can use to inform our reporting. For example, what are the age groups that attended? What specific age groups may be saying about a particular issue? What maybe a specific sex may be saying about a particular issue. Because sometimes we tend to see things as black and white, Marlene, but different characteristics of people intersect, and each individual have their own ideas and perspectives on issue. So an age, I may be a young person, but I may be a woman, I may be a woman who is differently abled. That conversation or the issues that are important to that person may be different, let us say, from a man who is elderly and maybe who is a widow, that kind of thing. So, and that's why we do the polling in the session, so that we start to see what are the commonalities. And that is then how we pull out what are the immediate priorities.
Interesting. Well, you have a lot of interesting conversations ahead, and I do hope that people are open to participate. Is it only online? Does someone have to have internet access and participate in that way?
Currently, for the open dialogues, yes, we're doing them virtually, and we are mindful of the regulations that the government has set out as it relates to COVID-19. Of course, there are health issues and risk issues. And so the open dialogues are virtual. We are also working on the specific dialogues as also being virtual. However, where we find that there may be need to have smaller groups when it comes to the special interest, those are going to be dealt with on a one-on-one basis, and it will depend on a lot of issues because in Belize right now there are hotspots in certain areas when it comes to COVID-19 and so on. So we have to also be careful when we are engaging in any conversation. At this point, we are focused on the virtual dialogues, but we have not excluded having when it comes to the specific interest groups. That in order to ensure that voice is heard, we have set out that we may have to do a few what we call smaller sessions, but in maintaining, of course, the protocol of COVID-19.
And just to be clear, this dialogue that you are organizing to feed into the global dialogue that's taking place as well, it's not just about identifying problems. As I read it, you're also looking for people who think they have solutions that they'd love to put forward.
Absolutely. And this is why we say risk and opportunities.
Yes.
Because there are challenges. Like I mentioned earlier, technology is an opportunity, but it has some risk. So how is it that you identify the risks that emerge in using technology and leapfrogging, learning, healthcare, business, governance, the delivery of services to the people, and so on? Technology can help us to leapfrog our country and move us to move from a developing to a developed status, but it comes with its risks, and so it's ensuring that we manage those risks and we maximize the opportunities. So everything that we do, there are risks, but there is also opportunities, and so when we have the dialogues, we have that conversation. The conversation speaks to the future, it speaks to the immediate, and it speaks to the obstacles and barriers to reaching that future, and then what are the solutions to addressing those barriers and obstacles to bring about the future that we want to see, Marlene, which is for Belize of prosperity and opportunity.
And we know we have some amazingly innovative people in this country.
Absolutely.
So it's a great opportunity to share that. Carolyn, talk to the people at home. So I know you're going to work with your specific groups so they'll be covered, but you want everyday Belizeans to feel comfortable to log on, sign up for a dialogue, and participate. Talk to them and tell them why this is an opportunity for them.
It's a great opportunity for all of us in Belize to have a voice and to have our voice be counted as we shape the future together. We must always be thinking of the future as well as thinking of the present. The present is us. The future is also us and the generations to come. If together we can come up with the priorities that we want to address, whether it's immediate or in the future, and we can also come up with the solutions, then that means that it is not a government thing or as an individual thing or a civil society thing, but rather it's a shaping of a future that is for Belize as well as a future that is for the global space. We're all citizens of the global space, not only Belize. So we ask everybody to join us. We have a dialogue that is taking place today. It's at 12 noon. We will be posting on my particular Facebook page, you'll be posting the Zoom link for that. If you want to participate and you would like that Zoom link as well, all you need to do is to contact me at 670-0509. That's my phone number. 670-0509, or you can email me at carolyntrench@gmail.com and I will share the information with you. In addition, Marlene, we are also asking people to sign on to the UN online survey, because that is also another opportunity for people to make their contributions. So we are doing it in the national space in Belize, but we're also doing it in a global space as well, whereby there is an online survey. And it's some of the very issues that we recently discussed. Those are within the survey. So we're asking people, it's UN 75 online, They just have to put that in the Google link and it will come up.
Yeah.
They will click on it and they can answer the survey. It only takes a minute. And that in itself, the more Belizeans do that, the more our voices are going to be heard and counted globally.
And that's a wonderful opportunity. So we want to thank you. I hope that schools are encouraging their students to do it too. That would be great. If you have an online class, get your students to participate. Because as you said, it's a way to get our voice counted into the global agenda setting. So
exactly.
Carolyn, we thank you so much for telling us all about it. That first dialogue, or the next dialogue, I should say, happens today at noon.
Right.
So people can log on to the site and register for today, and then you have 2 subsequent ones coming up as well, right?
And those are the open dialogues, and then we also have the specific interest groups that people can contact us if they have specific groupings that they want to participate in the dialogue. We are reaching out to people as well, but then people can also contact us. CarolynTrench@gmail.com. Easy to email to.
All right, Carolyn, thank you so much for telling us all about what's happening and for reminding us that we have the opportunity to participate in this dialogue.
Absolutely, and to shape the future together.
That's right. Thank you, and stay safe.
You too, Marlene.
All right, so with that, we are going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about what's happening this week in Disability Awareness Week, and we'll find out what are some of the issues, how people are coping, and how the week is being commemorated. So we'll take that break, and when we come back, that's the conversation we'll be having.